Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are on Journal Collection number 56, and this dates from 1865, and Emerson will turn 62, and it is among the shorter of the journal collections. I will be recording this one in all-in-one video. It won't be split into parts. And I believe after the one after that, they start getting pretty short, as I have speculated before. And now that I can look through Volume 10, they do indeed get very short. So, with that said, I will begin this one, and of course, it begins with an editorial biographical update. The war was drawing to a close, yet no one dared hope the end was so near. The times were hard, and the winter severe. Mr. Emerson went west in January, lectured in Pittsburgh and Ohio, and apparently gave short courses in Chicago and Milwaukee. In his letters he spoke of bitter weather. End note. Concord, February 13th, 1865. Home from Chicago and Milwaukee. Chicago grows so fast that one ceases to respect civic growth, as if all these solid and stately squares, which we are wont to see as the slow growth of a century, had come to be done by machinery as cloth and hardware are made, and were therefore shoddy architecture without honor. 'Twas tedious, the squalor and obstructions of travel. The advantage of their offers at Chicago made it necessary to go. In short, this dragging of a decorous old gentleman out of home and out of position to this juvenile career was tantamount to this: I'll bet you $50 a day that you will not leave your library and wade and ride and run and suffer all manner of indignities and stand up for an hour each night reading in a hall. And I answered, I'll bet I will. I do it and win the $900. Editor's note. In the beginning of spring, a happy event had happened in Mr. Emerson's family. William Hathaway Forbes, elder son of John Murray Forbes, a major in the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, had been taken in the previous May in hand-to-hand fight with Mosby's guerrillas when pinned down by his dying horse. He was held prisoner at Columbia, South Carolina, escaped in late autumn, and was retaken, but soon after released on parole. In March he became engaged to Mr. Emerson's younger daughter Edith, and was exchanged just in time to rejoin his regiment as lieutenant colonel, and he was present at Lee's surrender. End note. Wilkinson, always an affirmative writer, radiant, intellectual, humane, brave, as such are. April 10th. General Hooker, in his order from his headquarters at Cincinnati, assuming command of the Department of the Northwest, says to every officer and soldier, no one will consider the day as ended until the duties it brings have been discharged. I value the fortnightly Publisher's Circular, mainly for its Paris correspondence, containing, as it does, biography of literary men in Paris, and showing the identity of literary life in Paris with our own, scattering the illusion that overhangs Paris in the eyes and reports of frivolous travelers, and showing there just as much a coarse and vindictive Bohemia as New York is for dissipated young men of talent. 'Tis far the best that the rebels have been pounded instead of negotiated into a peace. They must remember it, and their inveterate brag will be humbled, if not cured. George Minot used to tell me over the wall, when I urged him to go to town meeting and vote, that votes did no good, what was done so wouldn't last, but what was done by bullets would stay put. General Grant's terms certainly look a little too easy, and I fear that the high tragic historic justice which the nation, with severest consideration, should execute, will be softened and dissipated and toasted away at dinner tables. That the problems that now remain to be solved are very intricate and perplexing, and men are very much at a loss as to the right action. If we let the Southern states into Congress, the Northern Democrats will join them in thwarting the will of the government, and the obvious remedy is to give the Negro his vote. And then the difficult question comes, What shall be the qualification of voters? We wish to raise the mean white to his right position, that he may withstand the planter, but the Negro will learn to write and read, which should be a required qualification, before the white will. To be amused. People go into the church as they go into the parlor to be amused. The frivolous mood takes the most of the time, as the frivolous people make the majority. And Cicero said of the Greeks and eastern provinces that they gave themselves to art for forgetfulness and consolation of servitude. And then there is a Latin phrase here I will try to pronounce very slowly. Oblectamenta et solitium servitutis. The thunderbolt strikes on an inch of ground, but the light of it fills the horizon. I should say of Samuel Hoare, Sr., what Clarendon writes of Sir Thomas Coventry, that he had a strange power of making himself believed the only justifiable design of eloquence. The mind of Locke will not always be the measure of human understanding. Sampson Reed. There is no police so effective as a good hill and wide pasture in the neighborhood of a village, where the boys can run and play and dispose of their superfluous strength and spirits to their own delight and the annoyance of nobody. Criticism, illusion of words. There are really few people who distinguish on reading a page full of words from a page full of new experience. They are satisfied with the first if it is in harmony with their habitual opinions. They say it is good and put it in my hands, or will read it to me and are discontented if I slight it. But they never take it up again because it makes no impression on their memory, whilst they do remember and return to the page of real experiences and thus vindicate the critic. For inspiration, the experience of writing letters is one of the best keys to the modus of it. Immortality. The path of spirits is in silence and hidden from sense. Who knows where or how the soul existed before it was incarnated in mortal body? Who knows where or how it thinks and works when it drops its fleshly frame? Like those asteroids which we call shooting stars, which revolve forever in space, but sweeping for a moment through some arc of our atmosphere, and heated by the friction, give out a dazzling gleam, then pass out of it again on their endless orbit invisible. President Lincoln. Why talk of President Lincoln's equality of manners to the elegant or titled men with whom Everett or others saw him? A sincerely upright and intelligent man as he was, placed in the chair, has no need to think of his manners or appearance. His work day by day educates him rapidly and to the best. He exerts the enormous power of this continent in every hour, in every conversation, in every act, thinks and decides under this pressure, forced to see the vast and various bearing of the measure he adopts. He cannot palter. He cannot but carry a grace beyond his own, a dignity by means of what he drops, such as all his pretension and trick, and arrives, of course, at a simplicity which is the perfection of manners. May 6th. In reading Mark Antonine last night, it was pleasant to be reminded by some of his precepts of a living example in a dear person near me. We are such vain peacocks that we read in an English journal with joy that no house in London or in Paris can compare with the comfort and splendor at Delmonico's in New York, but I was never in Delmonico's. And then there is a French quotation here, seemingly by Lafayette, and then something from Bonaparte, and then I'll catch up where the English starts. Saint Beuve vindicates the noble, unique fidelity of Lafayette, but finds in him credulity. And Sumner, who read here in Concord a lecture on Lafayette, is of all Americans the one who is best entitled by his own character and fortunes to read his eulogy. Then there's another French quotation, untranslated. Boileau asks Molière, "Where the devil do you get your rhyme?" For inspiration has unknown resources, has cunning also. If I were successful abroad in talking and dealing with men, I should not come back to my library and my work as I do. When the Spirit chooses you for the scribe to publish some commandment, if it makes you odious to men, and men odious to you, you shall accept that loathsomeness with joy. The moth must fly to the lamp. The man must solve those questions, though he die. Talk with Alcott. Assured him that character was the result of pagan morals. All the victories of religion belong to the moral sentiment. The parson calls it justification by faith. All the victories, all the convictions, all the anxieties of revivals are the old eternal fact of remorse for wrong and joy in the right. It is becoming to the Americans to dare in religion to be simple, as they have been in government, in trade, in social life, and they have rightly pronounced toleration, that no religious test shall be put. They are to abolish laws against atheism. They are not to allow immorality. They are to be strict in laws of marriage. They are to be just to women, and property, and votes, and personal rights. And they are to establish the pure religion, justice, asceticism, self-devotion, bounty. They will lead their language round the globe, and they will lead religion and freedom with them. It was his tender conviction of this power and presence that made Jesus a light in the world, and the spirit that animated him is as swift and puissant today. Scientific men with their atheism, like the French savants, appear to me insane men with a talent, and the cure would be the opening of the moral sentiment. There is far more than bare works. There is faith also, that is, the raptures of goodness are as old as history, and new with this morning sun. The language and the legends of Arabia and India and Persia are of the same complexion as the Christian. Vishnu Purana bear witness. Socrates, Zeno, Menu, Zarathustra, Confucius, Rabia are as tender as St. Francis, St. Augustine, and St. Bernard. We say there exists a universal mind which imparts this perception of duty, opens the interior world to the humble obeyer. It has been imparted in all ages. Religion is the homage to this presence. Admirable fairness of Elizabeth Hoar's mind. I think no one who writes or utilizes his opinions can possibly be fair. She will see finer nuances of equity, which you will never see if untold. She applied the Napoleon mot, respect the burden, so well to Lincoln as to the attitude of Wendell Phillips. And one may say there is a genius for honesty as well as for poetry, and nobody can anticipate the directness and simplicity of the true man. The best in argument is not the accosting in front the hostile premises, but the flanking them by a new generalization which incidentally disposes of them. It should be easy to say what I have always felt, that Stanley's Lives of the Philosophers or Marcus Antoninus are agreeable and suggestive books to me, whilst St. Paul or St. John are not, and I should never think of taking up these to start me on my task, as I have often used Plato or Plutarch. It is because the Bible wears black cloth. It comes with a certain official claim against which the mind revolts. The book has its own nobilities, might well be charming if it was left simply on its merits as others, but this "you must," it is your duty, repels. 'Tis like the introduction of martial law into Concord. If you should dot our farms with picket lines, and I could not go or come across lots without a pass, I should resist or else emigrate. If Concord were as beautiful as paradise, it would be detestable at once. When divine souls appear, men are compelled by their own self-respect to distinguish them. Whenever the moral sentiment is affirmed, it must be with dazzling courage. As long as it is cowardly insinuated, as with the wish to show that it is just what the Church receives today, it is not imparted and cannot be owned. May 28th. In the acceptance that my papers find among my thoughtful countrymen in these days, I cannot help seeing how limited is their reading. If they read only the books that I do, they would not exaggerate so wildly. Select books, select anecdotes, select discoveries, select works of art, select men and women. The most accomplished man should bring his contemporaries to the high culture by pointing out these with insight and reverence. The graduate at the university should know the famed lines Pythagoras devised, for which a hecatomb he sacrificed. Should know Archimedes' Eureka, should know Newton's binomial theorem inscribed on his tomb, as well as his optical and astronomic and chemical insights, should know Da Vinci's cartoon and Michelangelo's Pisan soldiers, should know Brunelleschi's dome, and Michael's should know Columbus's guess and its grounds, should know Alfred's rough hints of English freedom, Roger Bacon's inventions, and, as far as possible, the history of the magnetic compass, should know the Homeric controversy, should know the wonderful illumination thrown on all history in our own day by the scholars of the Sanskrit, should know the history of the Mahabharata, should know the history of Zoroaster, what and who and when was he, see Nicholas Grimwald's verses on Zoroaster, should know how the decimal zero was invented. In literature, there are many curiosities of the second or third order which should be known, as the Imitation of Christ of a Kempis, or of Gerson, as the Farce of Petelin, as the Song of Roland, as the Marriage de Figaro, and the Marseillaise of Roget. So in England, the sonnets of Shakespeare, the Paradise of Dainty Devices, specially too, the Morte d'Arthur. I must think that Carlyle's humor and demonic fun, telling the story in a gale, bantering, scoffing, now at his hero, now at the enemy, always, too, at the learned reporters he has been consulting, will affect all good readers agreeably, for it is a perpetual flattery to the wise reader, a tete-a-tete with him, abusing the whole world as mad dunces, all but you and I, reader. Editor's note. The rest of the journal, K.L., is devoted to the poem May Day. June, but it comes with a question mark. America shall introduce pure religion. Ethics are thought not to satisfy affection, but all the religion we have is the ethics of one or another holy person. July. Our young soldiers. These dedicated men who knew on what duty they went, and whose fathers and mothers said, "We gave him up when he enlisted." We see the dawn of a new era, worth to the world the lives of all this generation of American men, if they had been demanded. It is commonly said of the War of 1812 that it made the nation honorably known. It enlarged our politics, extinguished narrow sectional parties, but the states were young and unpeopled. The present war, on a prodigiously enlarged scale, has cost us how many valuable lives, but it has made many lives valuable that were not so before, through the start and expansion it has given. It has fired selfish old men to an incredible liberality, and young men to the last devotion. The journals say it has demoralized many rebel regiments, but also it has moralized many of our regiments, and not only so, but moralized cities and states. It added to every house and heart a vast enlargement. In every house and shop an American map has been unrolled and daily studied, and now that peace has come, every citizen finds himself a skilled student of the condition, means, and future of this continent. I think it a singular and marked result that the war has established a conviction in so many minds that the right will get done, has established a chronic hope for a chronic despair. This victory the most decisive, this will stay put. It will show your enemies that what has now been so well done will be surely better and quicker done, if need be, again. America. The irresistible convictions of men are sometimes as well expressed by braggart lips or in jeers that sound blasphemous, and the word manifest destiny, which is profanely used, signifies the sense all men have of the prodigious energy and opportunity lying idle here. The poor Prussian or Austrian or Italian escaping hereto discovers that he has been handcuffed and fettered and fast tied all his lifetime, with monopolies and duties at every toll gate, on his little cart of corn or wine or straw, or on his cow or ox or donkey, and padlocked lips, padlocked mind, no country, no education, no vote, but passports, police, monks, and foreign soldiers. July 23rd. Notes for Williamstown. Returns the eternal topics, the praise of intellect. I gain my point, gain all points whenever I can reach the young man with any statement which teaches him his own worth. Thus, if I can touch his imagination, I serve him. He will never forget it. If I can open to him for a moment the superiority of knowledge to wealth or physical power, especially works on me at all times any statement of realism, and old as my habit is of thrumming on this string, I must continue to try it, till in a manlier or a divine hour I can see the truth and say it. It occurred the other day with a force not retained that the advocate of the good cause finds a wealth of arguments and illustrations on his way. He stands for truth, and truth and nature help him unexpectedly and irresistibly at every step. All the felicities of example, of imagery, of admirable poetry, old religion, new thought, the analogies of science throng to him and strengthen his position. Nay, when we had to praise John Brown of Osawatomie, I remember but a multitude of fine verses of old poetry fitted him exactly, and appeared to have been prophetically written for the occasion. One drug needs another drug to expel it. It feasts, then wine, after wine, coffee, and after coffee, tobacco. If vanity, then pride. If anger, then war, sword and musket. But temperance is strength, and essence is religion. To be is to live with God. Miss Peabody tells me that Jones Very one day said to her, "To the pre-existent Shakespeare wisdom was offered, but he declined it and took only genius." Child of the people. That fair, large, sound, wholesome youth or maid whom we pick out in a whole street full of passengers as a model of native strength is not to be raised by rule in schools or gymnasia. It is the Vermont or New Hampshire farm, and a series of farmers laboring on mountain and moor that produce this rare result. When a good head for ciphering, trade, and affairs is turned out, he drifts to the city counting room, or perhaps to the law school, and brings thither a constitution able to supply resources to all the demand made on him, and easily goes ahead of all competitors as a firm will, cool head, and in the sequel plants a family which becomes marked through 2 or 3 generations for force and beauty, until luxury corrupts them as it had destroyed those whom they displaced. August 13th. A disaster of this year has been the loss of 6 or 7 valuable pear trees by the pear blight. I think in preceding years single boughs have withered and died, but these have not attracted much notice. But now I cut off half of each tree with its coppery leaves and the mournful smell of the sick bark, and shall not save them so. The difference between writers is that one counts forms and the other counts powers. The gazetteer, in describing Boston, reckons up the schools, the churches, and the missionary societies, but the poet remembers the alcoves of the Athenaeum or the Bates Library, certain wise and mannered men, certain fair women, and the happy homes in which he saw them. The friend, he is the power that abode with us, and the book, which made night better than day, that may be well counted. In the Revue des Deux Mondes, I found a paper on the future life, which suggested the thought that one abstains, I abstain, for example, from printing a chapter on the immortality of the soul, because when I have come to the end of my statement, the hungry eyes that run through it will close disappointed. That is not here which we desire, and I shall be as much wronged by their halting conclusion as they feel themselves by my shortcomings. Then there is a Italian quotation here, and a footnote states, "With this sentence for a text follows a similar passage on the loneliness and unpopularity of great souls to that printed in Progressive Culture." But the uh, it, but the translation isn't given. August 24th. Yesterday called on Forsyth Wilson at Cambridge, went into the city with him to the Athenian and Union Club. In how many people we feel the tyranny of their talent as the disposer of their activity. In Wendell Phillips, now the seul homme d'etat in America, I feel that this patriotism or his moral sentiment are not primarily the inspiration of his career, but this matchless talent of debate, of attack, of illustration, of statement, this talent which was in him and must be unfolded, that drove him in happy hours under most fortunately determining auspices into the lists where kings were to be competitors and nations spectators. The conduct of intellect must respect nothing so much as preserving the sensibility. Manners. There are things whose hour is always a little over or not quite come, as, for example, the rule that you shall not go out to dine too well dressed, which means that a certain slovenliness fits certain persons, but requires perfect aplomb, and clear sensible manners in conversation. Cold scholars cannot afford these liberties. Under a commanding thought, all people become as graceful as if they were asleep. That knows how to lay the hands and the feet as long since it knew how to make them. Scotus Erigena, sitting at the table of Charles the Bald, when the king asked him how far a Scot was removed from a sot, answered with Irish wit, by a table's breadth. The old sharper said, his conscience was as good as ever it was, he had never used it any. September 30th. Yesterday at our cattle show, I saw a man sitting in the town hall, so like to the late President Lincoln in the whole head that I called the attention of Reverend Mr. Reynolds to him, who at once recognized the fact. It was Elijah Wood of this town. The view was in profile, and he had his hand against his face, covering it a little, and so probably increasing the likeness. Nature is very rich in patterns, but cunningly, not so rich as she seems, and so repeats herself. Cousins of fourth and fifth degree have sometimes striking resemblance, and are therefore both repetitions of the common ancestor. Robert Winthrop, when young, strongly resembled the portrait in the Historical Society's rooms of Governor Winthrop. Indeed, I suppose the cunning artist does not quite repeat her type until after 4 or 5 generations, when all the rememberers are gone, and she can just duplicate every face of the 5th back generation without risk of confusion or discovery. But I don't think even this interval will be safe now, art having circumvented her with the photograph, which will force her to invent new varieties or lose her reputation for fertility. Mr. Benjamin Peter Hunt said that a young man of good position in Philadelphia went to the war and accepted the colonelcy of a colored regiment. On his return lately to Philadelphia, all his acquaintances cut him. Judge Hoare said to me that he had long ago made up his mind that the cutting was to be from the other side, that this country belonged to the men of the most liberal persuasion. Now in the time of the fugitive slave law, when the best young men who had ranged themselves around Mr. Webster were already all of them in the interest of freedom and threw themselves at once into the opposition, Mr. Webster could no longer see one of them in the street. He glared on them, but knew them not. His resentments were implacable. What did they do? Did they sit down and bewail themselves? No, Sumner and his valiant young contemporaries set themselves to the task of making their views not only clear, but prevailing. They proclaimed and defended them and inoculated with them the whole population, and drove Mr. Webster out of the world. All his mighty genius, which none had been so forward to acknowledge and magnify as they, availed him nothing, for they knew that the Spirit of God and of humanity was with them, and he withered and died as by suicide. Calhoun had already gone as Webster, by breaking his own head against the nature of things. Potentiality. In estimating nations, 'tis well to remember the sovereign nature which often remains when the actual performance is inferior. Thus, in England, what destroying criticism we can read or make on its education, its literature, its science, its politics. And yet the force of that race may still any day turn out a better man than any other. Theodore will buy a hat, a soft hat, or a beaver for summer or winter. In his choice, he looks about him in the street, or he remembers that his friend or that reputable citizen wears one of a certain form or color which is becoming. One good instance suffices him and guides to a certain extent his choice. But he does not consider that it is always character, personal force of some kind in the individual he thinks of, that makes the hat he wears so proper and perfect in its place. Beware of the minor key. Despair, whining, low spirits only betray the fact that the man has been living in the low circle of the senses and the understanding. These are exhaustible, and he has exhausted them, and now looks backward and bewails them. In Sterling's Secret of Hegel, the intellectual power from words to things went sounding on a dim and perilous way. Carlyle is to be defended plainly as a sincere man who is outraged by nothing so much as sentimentalism, or the stimulating of reform, and love of nature and love of truth. Therefore he detests progress of civility, enlightenment, new ideas, diffusion of knowledge, and all shallow insincerities coming under such names. November 5th. We hoped that in the peace after such a war a great expansion would follow in the mind of the country, grand views in every direction, true freedom in politics and religion, in social science and thought. But the energy of the nation seems to have expended itself in the war, and every interest is found as sectional and timorous as before. Williamstown, November 14th. I saw tonight in the observatory, through Alvan Clark's telescope, the Dumbbell Nebula in the Fox and Goose constellation, the 4 double stars in Lyra, the double stars of Castor, the 200 stars of the Pleiades, the nebula in Perseus. Mr. Button, Professor Hopkins's assistant, was our star showman, and Stanborough and Hutton, who have been in my committee of the Adelphic Union, inviting me here, carried me thither. I have rarely been so much gratified. Early in the afternoon, Professor Bascom carried me in a gig to the top of the West Mountain, and showed me the admirable view down the valley in which this town and Adams lie, with Greylock and his attendant ranges towering in front. Then we rose to the crest and looked down into Rensselaer County, New York, and the multitude of low hills that compose it. This was noted anti-rent country, and beyond in the horizon the mountain range to the west. Of all tools, an observatory is the most sublime, and these mountains give an inestimable worth to Williamstown in Massachusetts. But for the mountains, I don't quite like the proximity of a college and its noisy students. To enjoy the hills as a poet, I prefer simple farmers as neighbors. The dim lanthorn which the astronomer used at first to find his object glasses, etc., seemed to disturb and hinder him, preventing his seeing his heavens, and though it was turned down lower and lower and lower, he was still impatient, and could not see until it was put out. When it had long been gone, and I had looked through the telescope a few times, the little garret at last grew positively lightsome, and the lamp would have been annoying to all of us. What is so good in a college as an observatory? The sublime attaches to the door and to the first stair you ascend. That this is the road to the stars. Every fixture and instrument in the building, every nail and pin, has a direct reference to the Milky Way, the fixed stars and the nebulae, and we leave Massachusetts and the Americas and history outside at the door when we come in. December 10th. Dr. Jackson shone in the talk on Thanksgiving Day, explaining many things so successfully, the possibility of the balloon by the aid of gun cotton, one of whose principal merits he asserted was that it does not foul the barrel or engine as powder does, the ocean telegraph, which he thinks far less practicable, and certainly less desirable to us than the Siberian. Then the fact that the patents of the telegraph companies do not really protect the monopoly, for what is patented they no longer use, as the system of marks on paper of Morse's patent, for the telegraph is everywhere conducted without paper, being read by the ear. He thinks the United States Post Office should take possession of the telegraph as part of the postal arrangement, pay a compensation to the companies, and give its use to the people at a cent a word, and so save the immense transportation of letters by this imponderable correspondence. He told the story of the Rumford Medal voted to Ericsson by the American Academy, and the money voted to Roper and Company for valuable improvements on Ericsson, from which he last anticipates very great practical benefit. The Union or double Union engine. I.T. Williams told me the other day that 97% of caloric was wasted in all attempts to use caloric for force in mechanics. Dr. Jackson says much is lost, but nothing like so much. He knew Emery's chimney, which burns the smoke. Its advantage is demonstrable, yet it is not used, resembling thus Boyden's turbines, which pretend to save 97% of the power of a waterfall, and being tested were found to do what they claimed, yet are not used. It seems to be a fixed rule in the planting and growth of settlements that the men follow the waters. Thus, on each side of a height of land, the people will go to the market that is downstream. I.T. Williams told me that the last time he saw Albert H. Tracy, he told him that when he and Cass were in Congress, they became very intimate and spent their time in conversation on the immortality of the soul and other intellectual questions, and cared for little else. When he left Congress, they parted, and though Mr. Cass passed through Buffalo twice, he did not come near him and never saw him again until 25 years afterward. They saw each other through open doors at a distance in a great party at the President's house in Washington. Slowly they advanced towards each other as they could, and at last met, said nothing, but shook hands long and cordially. At last Cass said, "Any light, Tracy?" "None," answered Tracy, and then said, "Any light, Cass?" "None," replied he. They looked in each other's eyes, gave one shake more, each to the hand he held, and thus parted for the last time. When I was a senior in college, I think Samuel Barrett, whom I had known in Concord, was about to be ordained in the Chambers Street Church, and I called upon him in his room in college. I think he must have been a proctor. We talked about the vices and calamities of the time. I don't recall what the grim shadows were or how we came on them. But when I rose to go and asked him what was the relief and cure of all this, he replied with cheerful ardor, "Nothing but Unitarianism." From my remembrance of how this answer struck me, I am sure that this antidote must have looked as thin and poor and pale to me then as now. Carlyle. I have neglected badly Carlyle, who was so steadily good to me. Like a Catholic in Boston, he has put himself by his violent anti-Americanism in false position, and it is not quite easy to deal with him. But his merits are overpowering, and when I read Friedrich, I forget all else. His treatment of his subject is ever so masterly, so original, so self-respecting, so defiant, allowing himself all manner of liberties and confidences with his hero, as if he were his hero's father or benefactor. That he is proud of him, and yet checks and chides and sometimes puts him in the corner when he is not a good boy. That amid all his sneering and contempt for all other historians and biographers and princes and peoples, the reader yet feels himself complimented by the confidences with which he is honored by this free-tongued, dangerous companion, who discloses to him all his secret opinions, all his variety of moods, and varying estimates of his hero and everybody else. He is dangerous as a madman. Nobody knows what he will say next or whom he will strike. Prudent people keep out of his way. If genius were cheap, we should do without Carlyle, but in the existing population he cannot be spared. Reaction. Its power is as the need. Systole and diastole of the heart, ebb and flow of tide, centripetal and centrifugal, horse downhill and uphill, so the assailant makes the strength of the defense. Therefore we ought to pray, give us a good enemy, like the southerner who exasperates the too good-natured North into resistance, or like President Johnson, who outrages his opponents and mortifies his friends. Illusion. We know all things as in a dream, and are again ignorant of them according to vigilant perception. Plato and Sophist. The first illusion that is put upon us in the world is the amusing miscellany of colors, forms, and properties. Our education is through surfaces and particulars. Nature masks under ostentatious subdivisions and manifold particulars the poverty of her elements and the rigid economy of her rules. And as infants are occupied wholly with the surface differences, so multitudes of adults remain in the infant or animal estate and never see or know more. Moral sentiment. As the flower precedes the fruit and the bud the flower, so long before the opinion comes the instinct that a particular act is unfriendly, unsuitable, wrong. We are wonderfully protected. Memory. If we pierce to the origin of knowledge and explore the meaning of memory, we might find it some strange mutilated roll of celestial papyrus, on which only a disjointed jumble of universal traditions, of heavenly scriptures, of angelic biographies were long ago written, relics of a foreworld. The past will not sleep. It works still. With every new fact, a ray of light shoots up from the long-buried years. This is the end of Journal Collection number 56, which dates from the year 1865, when the author was 62 years old. Thank you for listening.